I knew something was wrong the moment I saw orange paint streaked across the grass behind our houses. Not because the markings were on my property, but because some of them curved straight into my neighbor's prize garden. By the time the utility company trucks arrived 2 days later, the same neighbor who had spent months complaining about a wooden utility pole behind my garage was standing in his backyard, watching a crew prepare to dig trenches through the flower beds he'd spent a small fortune building. The funny part was, none of it would have happened if he hadn't tried so hard to get rid of that pole in the first place. My name is Ryan Mercer, and this happened a few years ago in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Falls, Iowa. When my wife Emily and I bought our house, we weren't looking for anything fancy. We just wanted a little space, a decent garage, and enough yard for our dog to run around. The house was older, built sometime in the late 70s, and like most properties in that area, it came with a few quirks. One of those quirks was a wooden utility pole standing behind the garage near the back corner of the property. It wasn't beautiful. Nobody would ever put it on a postcard, but it worked. A service line ran from the road, crossed part of the property, and supplied power not only to the house, but also to two older storage sheds that previous owners had used as workshops. The pole had apparently been there for decades. I know because the former owner left behind boxes of photographs in the attic, and in every picture dating back 20 or 30 years, that same pole stood in exactly the same place. Honestly, after a few weeks, I barely noticed it anymore. Then Trevor Lang moved in next door. Trevor wasn't a bad guy at first, at least not in any obvious way. He was successful, confident, always talking about property values and home improvements. The kind of guy who somehow managed to mention how much things cost without sounding like he was trying to brag, even though he absolutely was. During his first year in the neighborhood, he transformed his backyard. What had once been a normal patch of grass became what he proudly called a landscape garden. And to be fair, it was impressive. Raised flower beds, imported decorative stone, winding brick walkways, custom lighting, small ornamental trees. It looked like something from a magazine. Every weekend, there seemed to be another contractor working on some new feature. Emily actually complimented him once. She came inside after walking the dog and said, "You know, Trevor's backyard is starting to look like a resort." I laughed and said, "Good for him, as long as he doesn't ask me to help pay for it." At the time, it was a joke. A few months later, it didn't feel nearly as funny. The first complaint came on a warm Saturday afternoon. I was cleaning out the garage when Trevor appeared near the fence line holding a glass of iced tea. He wasn't smiling. "Ryan," he called. "You got a minute?" I walked over thinking maybe he wanted to borrow a tool. Instead, he pointed toward the utility pole. "That thing has become a problem." I looked behind me. The pole. Yeah, it ruins the view from my patio. I remember blinking because I honestly thought he was kidding. He wasn't. Trevor explained that when he sat outside in the evenings, the wires passed above the corner of his garden and distracted from the landscaping. He said the pole made the area feel cluttered. Then he casually suggested that maybe I should move it farther back onto my property. "Trevor," I said, try not to laugh. "It's not a lawn chair. I can't just pick it up and move it." His expression tightened. "You know what I mean." "Actually, I don't. It belongs to the utility company. It's been there longer than either of us." "Well, there has to be a process." "Maybe, but I'm not starting one because you don't like the view." He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the pole for a few seconds before nodding. "I guess we'll see." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Neighbors disagree sometimes. That's life. But over the following weeks, little comments started appearing whenever we crossed paths. Trevor would mention how outdated the infrastructure looked. He'd talk about safety concerns. He'd point out that storms could damage old poles. None of it felt accidental. It felt like he was building a case. Emily noticed it too. One evening while we were having dinner on the back deck, she lowered her fork and asked, "Do you think Trevor is actually obsessed with that pole?" "A little," I admitted. "It's weird. Maybe he's trying to convince himself he has a reason besides not liking how it looks." I remember laughing at that because it sounded exactly right. The thing about Trevor was that he always needed to be the reasonable one in every conversation. He couldn't just dislike something. There had to be a justification, a principle, a safety issue, a higher purpose. Looking back now, I think that's why what happened next surprised me less than it probably should have. About 3 weeks later, I pulled into my driveway after work and noticed a utility company truck parked behind the properties near the alley access road. Two technicians were examining the pole. One of them had a clipboard. The other was tapping around the base with a tool. Trevor stood nearby with his arms folded, looking very interested in everything they were doing. The second I saw him standing there, I knew exactly what had happened. He hadn't convinced me to move the pole, so he'd gone looking for someone else who could. Type part 2 for the next section. When I walked over, one of the technicians introduced himself and explained that they were responding to a safety complaint regarding a potentially unstable utility pole. He didn't tell me who filed it, but he didn't need to. Trevor was standing 10 feet away, trying very hard to look innocent, which somehow made him look even guiltier. I thanked the technician and told him to do whatever inspection they needed. The truth was I wasn't worried. That pole had survived decades of Iowa winters, thunderstorms, and windstorms that had knocked down entire trees. If there was a problem, I wanted to know about it. The technician spent nearly 20 minutes examining everything. He checked the alignment of the pole, inspected the wood condition near the base, studied the hardware overhead, and reviewed records on a tablet. Trevor hovered nearby the entire time. At one point he even asked, "So would you say it's leaning?" The technician glanced up and shrugged. Not enough to be considered a structural concern. I saw Trevor's jaw tighten. Then came the verdict. The pole was stable. The installation was compliant. No replacement was needed. No repairs were recommended. Case closed. Or at least that's what everyone thought. As the technician continued reviewing records, something caught his attention. He frowned and zoomed in on a map displayed on the screen. Then he called his coworker over. The two of them spent a few minutes discussing something quietly before turning back toward us. "The pole itself is fine," he said, "but we're seeing some inconsistencies in the historical routing records for the underground service line feeding this location." Trevor immediately looked confused. Honestly, so did I. The technician explained that part of the electrical service supplying the pole traveled underground before emerging near the base. The original records dated back decades and weren't perfectly clear. Normally they might leave it alone, but because a formal safety complaint had triggered the inspection, company policy required them to verify the exact underground route before closing the file. "What does that mean?" I asked. "We'll send out a locating crew." Trevor looked relieved, probably assuming this was still somehow working in his favor. If anything, he seemed encouraged. He probably imagined they'd uncover some major issue and finally force the utility company to relocate the pole. He had no idea what was coming. 2 mornings later, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and immediately noticed bright paint markings across the grass. Red lines, orange arrows, small utility flags sticking out of ground. The locating crew had already been there. Most of the markings followed logical paths across my yard, but then I noticed something interesting. One set of lines curved toward the property line. Another crossed it completely. Then another. I walked farther back and followed the markings with my eyes until they disappeared directly into the corner of Trevor's elaborate landscape garden. I almost laughed, not because I knew what would happen next, but because I knew Trevor was going to hate it. Sure enough, a few minutes later, I saw him standing outside staring at the markings. His expression reminded me of someone watching a weather forecast that suddenly included a tornado warning. "What's all this?" he asked when he saw me. "Looks like utility markings. Why are they in my garden?" I shrugged. Probably because they're locating the cable. The cable shouldn't be in my garden. Maybe not. He stared at the paint lines again. This better not damage anything. There is something ironic about hearing him worry about potential damage from an inspection that he personally requested. I didn't point that out. I didn't need to. Reality was about to do it for me. The next morning, the excavation crew arrived. Not a massive construction team, just a small group with utility trucks and specialized equipment. Professional, efficient, the kind of people who do these investigations every day. The supervisor introduced himself and explained the process. They needed to expose portions of the buried cable at several locations to confirm its route and inspect its condition. Since the work order had been generated through a safety investigation, every required verification point had to be completed. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Actual confirmation. Trevor came outside almost immediately. "How much digging are we talking about?" he asked. The supervisor pointed toward the markings. "Only what's necessary." Trevor looked at the painted lines running through the edge of his garden. "You're not digging there, are you?" The supervisor checked his paperwork. "Wherever the marked route goes, we follow it." I watched the realization begin to spread across Trevor's face. It was slow at first, then very fast. The crew started near my side of the property. They carefully removed sections of soil and exposed portions of the underground line. Everything looked normal. The cable appeared to be in good condition. Then they moved toward the property boundary. That's where things became interesting. As it turned out, whoever installed the service decades earlier hadn't routed it according to modern landscaping preferences. The cable didn't travel neatly alongside fences. It didn't respect future garden designs. It followed the most practical path available at the time. And that path happened to cut diagonally beneath the exact corner of Trevor's prize landscape project. The first decorative stones came out around mid-morning. Workers carefully stacked them nearby. Then sections of soil were removed. Trevor followed every movement like a nervous parent watching surgeons operate on a child. "Can they put everything back exactly the way it was?" he asked repeatedly. The supervisor gave the same answer every time. "We'll restore the area when we're finished." Restore, not recreate, not guarantee perfection, just restore. By lunchtime, a narrow trench extended directly through 2 raised flower beds. Nothing catastrophic. Nobody was destroying the yard. The crew was actually being remarkably careful. But digging is still digging. Soil gets disturbed. Plants get moved. Symmetry disappears. And if you've spent months obsessing over every stone placement and flower arrangement, even minor disruption can feel enormous. I was standing near the garage when Trevor approached me. His voice was noticeably sharper than usual. "This is ridiculous." "What's ridiculous?" I asked. "All this over a simple inspection." I looked at him for a second before answering. "You asked for the inspection." His face turned red. "I asked them to inspect the pole, and they are. This has nothing to do with the pole anymore." I couldn't help smiling. Apparently it does. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped because there wasn't really an argument available. The utility company wasn't targeting him. They weren't punishing him. They were simply following procedures that his own complaint had activated. That's what made the entire situation so strangely satisfying. Nobody was being vindictive. Nobody was seeking revenge. Cause and effect were doing all the work themselves. Throughout the afternoon, the crew continued tracing the route. Eventually, they exposed the section closest to the pole base and completed their inspection. The supervisor gathered the findings and reviewed everything with his team. By then, Trevor looked exhausted. The excitement he'd shown when the original inspection started had completely disappeared. Now he just wanted the digging to end. Finally, near the end of the day, the supervisor approached both of us with the results. "Good news," he said. "The cable is in excellent condition." Trevor stared at him. "That's the good news?" "Yes." The supervisor smiled politely. "No damage. No safety issues. No installation concerns. Everything is functioning exactly as intended." There was a pause, so long you could practically hear Trevor's hopes collapsing. The entire complaint, the inspection, the locating crew, the excavation, all of it had produced one conclusion. The utility system was perfectly fine. The only thing that had changed was the condition of the garden sitting beside it. By the following morning, the crew returned to refill the trench and restore the landscaping as best they could. They worked carefully and professionally. The stones went back. The soil was replaced. The area was cleaned. To anyone driving past, it probably looked perfectly normal. But Trevor knew. He knew every flower bed had been adjusted. Every decorative curve had been interrupted. Every carefully planned line had been disturbed. And he knew exactly why. The funniest part was that nobody could reasonably blame the utility company. They had done their job. Nobody could blame me either. I hadn't filed a complaint. I hadn't requested an inspection. I hadn't even made a phone call. Yet somehow, the entire situation had unfolded exactly the way Trevor had feared from the beginning. And it was about to leave him with a lesson he would never forget. Type Part 3 for the final section. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal, at least on the surface. The utility trucks disappeared, the orange paint faded, and the trench became less noticeable as the landscaping settled back into place. If someone had visited the neighborhood for the first time, they probably wouldn't have seen anything unusual. But whenever I looked at Trevor's backyard, I could tell the difference. Not because the damage was dramatic. Honestly, it wasn't. The utility company had done exactly what they promised. They restored everything professionally. The flower beds were still there. The decorative stones were still there. The walkways still curved through the garden. But perfection is a strange thing. Once it's interrupted, even slightly, the person who created it notices every little detail forever. Trevor certainly did. Before all this happened, he used to spend hours outside tweaking things. He'd move a stone 3 inches to the left, then move it back. He'd trim plants with the precision of a surgeon. He'd walk visitors around the yard like a museum curator giving a private tour. After the excavation, that stopped. Not completely, but noticeably. The enthusiasm was gone. The pride was quieter. And maybe that was because every time he looked at that corner of the garden, he was reminded of the chain of events that led there. A few months later, I ran into him while taking out the trash. We hadn't really spoken much since the inspection. Things weren't hostile. They were just different. He nodded and glanced toward the utility pole behind my garage. The same pole, the same location, the same wires stretching overhead. Then he shook his head and laughed. It wasn't an angry laugh. It sounded more like someone finally accepting a joke they hadn't appreciated at first. You know, he said, that thing really doesn't bother me anymore. I smiled. Funny how that works. He laughed again and walked back inside. That was the last conversation we ever had about the pole. Years have passed since then, and it's still standing exactly where it always stood. Every now and then, when neighbors start arguing about fences, trees, parking spaces, or property lines, I think back to that whole situation because it taught me something I probably needed to learn. A lot of people assume that if they involve an authority, the outcome will automatically favor them. They imagine an inspector showing up and validating every complaint. They picture a company, a city department, or an HOA stepping in and forcing someone else to change. What they don't always realize is that investigations don't have loyalty. Procedures don't take sides. Once you invite professionals to look closely at a situation, they're going to look at everything, not just the part you want them to see. In Trevor's mind, the utility pole was the problem. He focused on it for months. He convinced himself it was unsafe, outdated, and somehow unfair to him. But when the inspection actually happened, the pole wasn't the issue at all. The system worked exactly as intended. The records got reviewed. The route got verified. The equipment passed inspection. The only unexpected consequence was the one he created himself. Looking back, I don't think Trevor was a bad person. I think he became so focused on controlling one tiny detail of his environment that he lost sight of the bigger picture. We've all done that at some point. Maybe not with a utility pole, but with something. We convince ourselves that fixing one annoyance will finally make everything perfect. Then we chase that idea so aggressively that we create bigger problems along the way. What makes this story memorable isn't that somebody got revenge. I never got revenge. I didn't need to. The utility company wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson either. The lesson arrived on its own through a perfectly ordinary process that nobody could have scripted better if they tried. To this day, whenever I walk past that corner of the yard, I still remember the sight of those bright paint markings curving across the grass and disappearing into Trevor's garden. I remember the confidence he had when the first inspection started. I remember the concern on his face when the locating crew arrived. And I definitely remember the moment he realized the excavation team was about to follow the cable wherever it went. Sometimes life has a sense of humor that's far better than anything we could invent ourselves. And sometimes the hole you dig for someone else ends up running straight through your own flower bed. So what do you think? Was Trevor justified in reporting something he genuinely believed was a problem? Or did he create his own headache by trying to force an issue that should have been left alone? Have you ever seen a neighbor dispute backfire in a way nobody expected? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a little neighborhood karma. because trust me, this wasn't the last time I learned that the simplest consequences are often the most satisfying.